Okay, I want to talk in this class about a couple issues that we almost talked about in the last class, but I saved them for now because I knew we needed another class on them. In the last class about migration, I attempted to convince you by blowing out your eardrums and by just talking to you that in fact, migration is a very old part of the human species. It's what made us human, and all the migrating that we did within Africa before anybody ever exited Africa was a huge part of how we became human and our being bipedal and all that stuff. So it's essential to our humanness, and it's also essential to the way in which humans spread out across the habitable world. So we tried to talk about that. And like I said, I tried to convince you of that. I also tried to convince you that in the modern times, in the last what am I going to call modern? In the last 500 years or so, that the largest number of people who were migrating in terms of percentages was in this 19th century, or what I think it was the historian Eric Hobsbawm called the long 19th century, from the French Revolution of 1789 through the beginning of World War I in 1914. There's just a lot of pretty world-shaping things that happen, and a lot of our inheritance and who migrated where is left over from that century. We're probably still living it out in some ways. And it's striking in some, I mean, like I said, by percentages, we're not as high as we were for immigration back in 1910 in terms of the percentages of people. And that may be a reason why some of you couldn't find international migrants. Maybe there aren't really as many of them as people believe. At the same time, if these things are true, and I've successfully been able to convince you that they're true, or at least posited that they're true, the problem, I guess, or the so then question is, why does migration feel so new? Why does it seem like that our border is constantly in crisis? And a lot of this has to do with the Fox News propaganda machine that is always showing us pictures of the border and people walking across and swimming across and all these things and getting us all riled up. When we talked about in the last class, this percentage of people has either stable or gone down over the past 10 years, but we're constantly being fed this stuff. So part of it is the media, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's being made to feel new, but there's something kind of deeper that I want to talk about. So in 1910, we talked about how 14.7% of US residents were foreign born, which is the all-time high. We're not at those levels today. I don't know if we'll ever get there again. It was, in terms of percentages, the all-time high. After that, as PJ noted about the Chinese Exclusion Acts and other immigration restrictions, there were a lot of legal clampdowns on immigrants from other countries starting in the 1920s. And so we have this period in time in which people really tried to restrict the flow of immigration, especially from certain places and certain peoples. The other thing that happens during this time, and we talked about this, is that some people who were kind of ambiguous, who people didn't know if they were going to fit into the United States system, were let into the system. So the Irish, who once were kind of put to the side, or the Italians, who were thought to be too Catholic and too given to crime and given to garlic, they get melted in and sort of become suburban whites for the most part. And some of you mentioned on the census form, for example, when it asks you to check off a race, but then check off origins, like many people who would mark off the white category would have to talk about 6 or 7 different origins. It's all kind of mixed up, and that's a consequence of this melting pot idea that put at least the whites into this suburban category and mixed them all up together. In general, this was because during this time, not just in the United States, in other countries as well, there was this idea that we had to make people into good Indians in India, or good Italians. That had happened a little bit all before, but there were these ideas that you had to assimilate people into a national system, and that this was going to happen around the world, again, not just in the United States, but in some of the countries that were newly independent and newly decolonized. Especially in the United States, what also happened, and of course, the Mexican immigration and migration has always been a feature of US society. Before the 1930s, there wasn't really a marked border in the sense that, sort of border crossings, walls, bridges, fences. I mean, people roughly knew where the border was, but it was pretty deregulated. You could kind of cross back and forth. Wasn't a big deal. And the Mexican population in the United States before the 1930s was throughout, as we saw in the video, part of the land that is now the United States was once in Mexican hands. So there were the people who were in those areas, but they were all over the place. There were large Mexican communities in Chicago and in Detroit. Again, this was before the 1930s. But after the 1930s, or during the 1930s, there was what they called Mexican repatriation. Basically, hey, you guys need to go back to Mexico. Part of this was voluntary because there were a lot fewer opportunities in the United States. The Great Depression made it harder to work, but part of it was discrimination and trying to get people back. So some of the places that were that had a large Mexican presence, like Detroit, for example, a lot of those were kind of cleared out. In its place, the United States instituted, especially in the West and places like California, sort of this idea. There was the Bracero program, which basically you'd take laborers from Mexico and they'd come during the time that you needed them to pick fruit, and that would be legally authorized, but then they'd go back in the off season. And of course, it wasn't a perfect program by any means, but it was a kind of way in which the labor flows were regulated, and a legal way to address the labor shortages, especially on the farms. The result of all these policies is that by the year 1970, we went down to 4.7%, an all-time low of US residents who were foreign born. And so you have this restrictions on immigration, the prioritization of assimilation, the repatriation and regulation of Mexican migration. And so we get down to this point in the 1970s where it's, I guess you could say it worked, in the sense if you wanted to restrict migration and immigration, it basically did. Now, the 1970s might seem like a long time ago, I guess 50 years and a little bit. But if you think about our main politicians today, you think about the two candidates who are the front runners for the US presidential race, they would have been, these would have been their formative years. So if you're like 70, 80 years old, let's say, this is the reality in which you were growing up. This would have been what you grew up with, say, in your 20s, was kind of a lack of foreign-born residents. And so many of the things that are happening in our own political system, I believe, are the result of people who grew up with a kind of a very different idea of the world, and they are kind of surprised that things have changed. Now, again, historically speaking, we're not at the same levels as we were back in 1910, but for people who came of age in the 1970s, it might feel different. Now, if you were living in the 1970s, you probably ended up growing up with a map of the world. Your worldview kind of looked like this. This was a map that was often on school walls. Fortunately, my mom told me that she hated this map. So I was early on schooled why this map was not the best representation of the world. It's wrong in at least 3 ways. Yeah.
It's very distorted because it's kind of flat. Obviously, the Earth is a globe, so it has to like make a lot of things closer to the North and South Pole a lot larger. Like Greenland is not that big.
Greenland is not that big. If you just look at this map, many children believe that Greenland is about the same size as South America. In real life, South America is 9 times as big as Greenland. 9 times. Look at how distorted that is. And it doesn't just distort things to the north and the south, it distorts things to the north. Look where the equator is. It's way down here. So 2/3 of the map is above the equator. Equator is supposed to be equal. It divides the world in half, and yet this Mercator projection gives high emphasis to anything north of the equator. Yeah, PJ.
I don't even know the word I want to use on that, but
It's a US-centric map. Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is a map. I mean, it's called a world map, right? But the United States is right in the center, which means that you might think that there's 2 Chinas. I mean, you wouldn't really think that, but there they are. They're cut in half. And you're cutting one of the largest, well, you're cutting the largest country by land area in half, and you're cutting what once was the largest by population partway in half. Oh, by the way, who's bigger than China now in population?
Oh, India.
India, yeah, they're winning.
It.
Yeah. I think it was. I think it's earlier this year. Yeah.
I think well, first of all, the size of Africa in comparison to if you look at Australia, kind of weird, but also I feel like the way it's put together is you can't. It seems like they made the ones they want you to know bigger, and then the other things you can't see what they are at all because they're so.
Yeah. And I mean, there's always been there's been pretty huge trade in this region of the world, but in this map, you kind of can't get there from here, right?
Powerhouses like China and Russia and America and
Yeah. Now this is a strange map. I hadn't noticed this before, but I like that that Antarctica is in a little box over here. just off the southwest of Australia, like it should be. Or for those of you who grew up thinking that Alaska was somewhere off the coast of California, because we often put it there in our maps. But yeah, I mean, I had talked about in the last class how Africa is actually 1.2 times all of North America, but you would never see that from looking at this map, or that Africa can fit 3 of the contiguous United States. It doesn't look like at all. Kind of. Yeah, it's closer. It's not as bad. It's certainly not as bad as Greenland in South America, which is truly egregious. So, but like I said, this is, I think, what many people in the 1970s would have grown up with, this idea that, we're the center of the world and everybody else is kind of smaller than us. Now, starting in the 1970s, I mean, this was happening before, but starting in the 1970s, there was a heavy emphasis on what is known as kind of ethnic labor recruitment. So you may notice this by going to certain places and certain restaurants that, certain people are working in different kinds of jobs. For example, I mentioned the Braceros program, bringing in Mexican labor in a regulated way. But once they ended the program, it wasn't like the need for labor had disappeared. It wasn't like anybody else was going to do that job. It's just that it wasn't authorized anymore. And so there were Mexican laborers who simply stayed around. And there were employers who would do the same thing they had been doing, but then it had become illegal. Now, the thing is that certain ethnic groups then get a reputation for being good workers in a certain field. For those of you who know, for example, in many places, Mexicans are known to have a stereotype of being super great workers. And so if you're an employer and you have a job and it's, I don't know, picking strawberries or running a restaurant or doing these kinds of things, and one of your employees is Mexican and is doing a good job, how do you get more workers?
Import them from another country.
Oh, but there's an easier way. Hey, do you know anybody? Right? I mean, that's a classic labor recruitment tool, right? That's the first thing you do is if you got a good worker, you say, hey, you know anybody? You got any friends, any family, anybody who's like you? And so actually, as Guest mentions, people don't just migrate willy-nilly. They don't just come in randomly. They are often pulled in either by an employer or by somebody who is employed by a different place. And so you'll end up with whole towns that are kind of composed of people from one village in Mexico or one village in Ecuador, because people get pulled into these by a very specific industry. The other thing that happens, again, these things don't happen willy-nilly, is that a lot of the immigration that we see comes from places where there has been some pre-existing either a colonial relationship, some sort of military relationship, or some sort of conflict. We talked in the last class about Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador. These are all places where the United States and others have supported right-wing governments that had death squads and all kinds of bad things that happened. And so people get pushed out of those areas. Where do they often end up? Well, they end up connected to the very people who are trying to keep them there. So this happens a lot, and a lot of people don't realize this because Bob Marley saying they don't know their history, and so they don't know where they're coming from, and so they have to ask people, what are you doing here? Again, this is often based on our own need to pull people in for various labor shortages. So I mentioned my wife, who was born in Queens, but her parents met here. They had been recruited as doctors from South Korea. So they got their medical degree. There was a shortage of doctors. Both of them, they basically came within a program in which the United States wanted to have Korean doctors or doctors from anywhere. So they're working there. And I was once looking at little baby pictures, and her ears are pierced as an infant, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if you struggled with your own parents about or witnessed the sort of disputes that people have in this country about when you pierce your ears. But in Mexico or in many places in Latin America, you just get your ears pierced immediately, like when you're born. That's just girls. When for a girl, that's how you show your girl, plunk, just pierce their ears. So this is puzzling to me because this is not something that happens in the United States. And it's not something that happens in Korea. And so I asked her, like, well, why'd they do that? Why'd you get your ears pierced when you're an infant? And she said it was the Filipina nurses had said that was the thing that you should do. So here are these Korean doctors working with nurses who had also been imported because of a labor shortage from the Philippines. The Philippines, as you may know, were once colonized by the Spanish, and so they have a lot of Spanish-derived traditions, including the piercing of the ears. And so my wife's parents thought that it was the American thing to do to get your ears pierced because they'd been talking to the Filipina nurses in this place. Now, what is this? Why were people coming in from Korea and the Philippines? What's the connection to the United States there? Yeah.
Well, at least for the Philippines, after the Spanish-American War, the United States took over the Philippines as basically a pseudo-colony. So that's sort of the connection there. For Korea, well, the Korean War, to prevent the, I guess, spread of communism and to sort of take a stand against North Korea invading South Korea, the United States permanently basically has a military presence there. And
Yeah.
Same applies in places like Japan.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is in both places, so yeah, a lot of people don't realize the United States, well, a lot of people don't realize the Spanish had the Philippines for a long time. There's a lot of similarities between what happens in the Philippines. There are some people who think that the Philippines should be kind of considered part of Latin America in some ways, because there's a lot of similarities there, a long colonization process. But yeah, the United States, like at the time we got Puerto Rico, also occupied the Philippines for quite a while. I think about 20 years, if I'm not mistaken. It was
About 50, 60.
okay, even more. So there's a long colonial relationship as well as a long military relationship. And with South Korea, yeah, it was a.
And we still have military bases in the Philippines.
We definitely have military bases in the Philippines, and we have a huge military presence in Korea. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
enormous. It's so again, people, it's not that people come into places like, hi, I'm here. I mean, they get pulled and pushed and pulled into places very specifically for these kinds of reasons. Now, the other thing that was happening in the 1970s is that we talked about this a little bit, the dream of sort of national development, that each nation would industrialize on its own. And this was a dream of first world countries. It was a dream of communist countries, second world countries, that they also pushed an industrialization idea. And it was also a dream of many places that were called third world countries. So they would be nationally independent, and then they would be able to industrialize. A lot of that started to fall apart in the 1970s, and a lot of people were unable to realize those kinds of dreams. And so you have this kind of mismatch between these desires to be middle class, to be professional, to have a better life for your children, and the realities of living in war-torn zones or places that aren't really able to make it, having to immigrate for education or for work. And so you have this idea that you need to be middle class. Now, for the people who were raised in the 1970s, and around that time, when they see people come in, they're like, whoa, where are all these people coming from? How did they get here? But remember, as Bob Marley tells us, if you know your history, you know why people get here, and you know that they've been pushed or pulled in a very specific way. But for, like I said, for many people that are currently leading our political parties in the United States, this is seen as this new thing. It's going to turn the world upside down. The difference. Huh?
I don't like how that looks. It looks wrong.
It looks wrong. I mean, there's really nothing wrong about it when you think about it. There's no reason the North should be on the top of the map. It's just a spinning globe in space, and you can label things all differently, call it our world. But it is true that it kind of gives me a headache to look at it. I keep wanting to flip it over or do something. It's good to look at it, but not for very long. You should contemplate it. So I want to talk about this in terms of something that talked about Bourdieu a few classes ago in his ideas of habitus, which are very difficult to understand. But this I kind of find useful, and I think it might be useful for us in thinking about migration, but also going into the chapter on politics and power. So Bourdieu said, or he outlined, this idea that basically when there's a debate between two sides, the universe of opinion or the universe of argument or discourse, there's two positions: orthodoxy, which you represented with a plus, and heterodoxy, which you represented with a minus. But they depend upon what he called the universe of the undiscussed or the undisputed. And so I think what he was trying to say is that in order to have a debate, you have positions, but you also have these underlying assumptions, which people don't really call into question, even if they are having a debate. So since we're doing immigration has, as we learned in the last class, has long been a matter of debate or opinion in the United States. Probably throughout the history of the United States, it's always been something that's talked about. Are you for or against? What should we do about immigration? It's always been posed as a problem. I'm trying to think if what's the orthodox opinion? The standard idea about immigration in this country. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think that I would agree with that. That the orthodox opinion is it's fine, but everybody should do it the right way. It should all be legal. Get in line. That's basically the orthodox opinion on immigration. And we could spend some time talking about how long the lines are, but trust me, they're really long. And it's not easy to do it the right way. What would be the heterodox argument to that? What's the other position? Yeah.
I think that's the biggest is like no one is equal.
No one is illegal. And the idea is still on that. No one is. So yeah, I mean, there are people who are pro immigration in various ways. I think that is, I think that is a heterodox opinion in the sense of it's not mainstream. In fact, you have to fight to find it sometimes. Both of these things perhaps rely on an assumption. When we talk about this debate between immigration, yes or no, legal or should it be illegal, what is the underlying assumption? The underlying doxa here that both sides end up agreeing to. That's probably too hard. We'll learn about this in the next chapter. The underlying assumption is that everybody belongs to a nation. That you have to belong to a nation, that you should belong to a nation. And it's basically, well, should we have more or less? So this is kind of the John Lennon Imagine map of the world in which there are no countries, which is for most of human history, up until, I don't know, a few hundred years ago, there really weren't countries. There weren't borders. There weren't the idea of the nation. Again, we'll talk about that in the next class, but that's the unspoken assumption, is the idea that everybody should belong to a nation. Should they? I think this is, you can do this with various debates, and you can see how things move into and out of the universe of discourse, and from doxa into opinion and back again. One example I like to use is same-sex marriage. So let's rewind to the 1950s, right? Let's go back a ways. No, okay, well, we won't literally do it, just in your heads. Yeah, well, sorry. In your heads, in the 1950s, and let's just stick in the 1950s for now. What was the doxa on same-sex marriage? Or what was the opinion? If I talk to let's see, how far back is that going to be for you? I guess grandparents. Yeah, it's going to be your grandparents. I only have to talk to my parents, but you have to talk to your grandparents. If you talk to your grandparents about what the attitudes were in the 1950s towards same-sex marriage, it wasn't even a thing, right? It wouldn't even be in their universe of knowledge, right? Talk about something that would be undisputed. It would be undisputed doxa that would never, it's like, I don't even know what it would be like. It would be completely out. It wasn't a part of the debate. It wasn't even a part of the debate. So same-sex marriage enters into the debate as a heterodox opinion, trying to think of the year.
That's pretty ironic, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, hetero means other, right? So it means other than, and that's, yeah, okay, that is ironic, but we're not, anyway. It enters as a heterodox opinion, probably about I'm gonna say in the 1990s around. As people start to advocate for it. A lot of it had to do with healthcare, by the way, and insurance. And, because we have such a strange healthcare system in this country, if you had a long-term relationship with someone, but were not recognized by marriage, you were effectively uninsured if you had insurance through your partner. Anyway, but it definitely enters in as heterodox opinion, right? It took a long time before even some of the liberals would embrace it. I think for a while, I think it moved over into being pretty much the orthodox opinion. I would say. I think it's supported now by, if I read correctly, it's supported by 70% of the population. So it's become an orthodox opinion. Heterodox now is to say that to be anti. I would say that for your generation, correct me if I'm wrong, I would say that for your generation, it's kind of like Doxa now. What do you think? In the sense that you would not even see it as debatable. It shouldn't even be debated, PJ.
That kind of is like a regional thing. I don't think it's like a whole like generation, because I don't believe in like generational beliefs of like, I don't know, like certain words like derogatory terms, like, oh, that person's 85. I was okay, no, like you can learn. But I think regionally, like if you ask somebody from like, I don't know, like Louisiana, you ask a teen or like somebody our age, like they probably would be like, no, that's wrong. So I think it's more of just like where you grow up that would depend on the docs of it. But
It may be that my exposure is to your generation in the Northeast.
right.
How about that? Is it Northeastern Doxa? Are you willing to say that?
In my opinion, like upstate is definitely more conservative. So even if like you go to Franklin,
There's that Franklin coming up again.
they may disagree. I don't know. I just think it's based off of what you were raised with. Even that's a little difficult because like you could be raised extremely conservative and then being liberal. So I think it's just this person.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say that there's a sense in which I think it is moving back into the realm of debate and opinion. But I think for a few years, it was totally Doxa. Even in Louisiana and Franklin, it was like Doxa to be. It was fine. Yeah.
It feels like the narrative is just changing. Like it's not about same-sex marriage anymore. It's about like, I don't know. I guess it's a lot about education these days and like, you know, the whole don't say gay stuff and like, what teachers can teach children nowadays, like to sort of push back against public schooling. And I don't think a lot of people really care about gay marriage anymore. I think it's more about things like education and like children specifically.
Yeah, I think the realm of debate has definitely shifted, and that's why when you say I don't think people care about same-sex marriage, I kind of, that's why I think it's for the most part Doxa. Like to go up against that is like
I think
hard.
there's still people who like care about that stuff, but that's not what they're talking about anymore, because they know that's not what people are generally talking about anymore.
Right,
So
they're,
if you have
you're
someone
right.
who doesn't support gay marriage, they're not gonna talk about gay marriage as much anymore, because they know that's not gonna get. them
yeah,
very
but
consensus.
they can wedge in somewhere else
Yeah.
and bring that into the realm of opinion, yeah.
It's so crazy how
Right.
fast things have shifted, like, I remember reading about this, like Lawrence v. Texas was, back in 2003, and that was just, decriminalizing same-sex relations at all.
Right.
Like, that was 20 years ago.
Right.
Where, like, half of the country it was still illegal to have any, not even just like marriage, but just have any homosexual relations. And it's how quickly it's changed in this country.
Yeah, which is always dangerous because that means it can change quickly back, but yeah, PJ.
I agree with Bourdieu in the sense of like it's become more about children, because I think that, I don't know, I almost feel as though the people who are giving that pushback is wrong, kind of at least, okay, I'll use generational on this portion, like they didn't really push on us that it was a bad thing. I think they realized that, and now they're like, well, now we have to try and do it next time, because this one we got starting in maybe think it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's this, you know, the sense of being embattled has shifted. And, you know, that's what it means when a certain position either starts to occupy the orthodoxy or the doxa, then the people who are, you know, trying to feel like they're being pushed aside, or, you know, they start trying to shift the lens. Sometimes I play around with Bourdieu's circles and squares a little bit. So imagine you lived in a society in which most things were doxa. Most people didn't really discuss or fight or have opinions about things. There was a little bit of opinion, but not too much. Can you imagine a society, or can you think of any places that might be like this in our world, where there's not, most of the things nobody really talks about because it's all assumed. There's a little bit of fighting, but it's like a little bit here and there on the edges.
Now North Korea.
I mean, in some ways, I mean, there may be, yeah, you might even shrink that opinion down to nothing. I mean, you know, yeah, because if you eliminate all the opinion, then you're left with authoritarian society. I mean, that's kind of, I don't know if that counts, because it's like, you know, actively eliminating it is kind of mean. I'm thinking about places where people just generally agree and don't discuss much because you don't have to. Yeah.
I think it tends to be a common thing with nation states. Like, I know the culture in Japan is very much like that, where you don't really talk to strangers. You just sort of go on about your day, and you don't really. I mean, at least from Japanese people I've talked to and what I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some people would call this I get nervous about this, but some people would refer to this kind of as a traditional society, right?
Yeah.
Where almost everything is known, you know, nobody's really fighting the rules, you know, and so, I mean, yeah, we saw that a little bit with the, you know, when the Brazilian Japanese tried to go back and just, you know, they're said they can't fit in. And so their response to it is to sort of, you know, be more Brazilian than they were. But yeah, it's a problem whenever you have this kind of strong emphasis on, you know, that we all are the same, or that we all think the same, we all do the same things. You get this kind of world. I mean, some people like that. What about this society? In this society, nobody really agrees on anything. There's like a little bit of stuff, but for the most part, every time we walk down the street, we might be getting in an argument about how you're walking and what kind of people you're hanging out with. Everything is up, almost everything is up for debate. Yeah.
The United States of America.
The United States. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways this might be true. I think there's a lot of assumptions that we make as Americans that we don't realize, but yeah, this seems to bear where we are. Well, let me know. Do you think the United States is more like this or more like this? Because I feel like in recent years, it's like the people out here and the people out there are so far apart that they're not even living in the field of reality, the same reality anymore. They're getting different facts, different information. Can't even have an argument anymore because you can't really have an argument if you don't even agree upon what the facts are. I don't know. What do you think? Which of these is more like the United States? 1, 2, or 3?
I'm
3.
gonna say 3 because I talked to a flat earther before.
Huh. Yeah, I feel like I'm doing an eye doctor thing. Which is better, A or B? It's just it's an interesting little exercise that you can do with various issues. You know, what, yeah, I once had to go, you know, I was thinking about this in terms of gun violence issues and gun control and like what things are doxa, and I mean it gets too depressing now if you start thinking about some things like that. You're like, oh man, it'll never change. Yeah, PJ.
I think, I mean, you also can do this with it. But like, I think with back to discuss.
Oh yeah, that, wow, right.
I think like I.
Yeah.
Like I feel like when you were out there, like getting it to prevent, like not getting them to prevent autism was like a huge conversation.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, you know, the vaccination thing was, I mean, when I was growing up was like complete doxa. I mean, you just lined up in a school. You didn't even tell your parents, man. Talk about indoctrination in children. They just, you know, they just doxed you up right there and sent you home, you know, and it was good. You know, and it did a lot of good, but then there was a, you know, the anti-vaccine movement started long before COVID, but boy, oh boy, did they get a big boost from that one. They really got excited. Yeah.
It's like a lot worse when we were like infants, because I know my mom has told me that my aunt was kind of talking her out of it. She's like, well, you don't want this baby to like get autism. Pretty as an adult now with autism anyways, like it's just been very weird.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, the science, the science has definitively shown that that isn't true, but boy, it sure is rumored out there.
So what the hell is wrong with having autism? I don't like the assumption that.
They feel weird as my aunt like fostered children specifically with autism. So the fact that she was preaching that's weird, but
So I got my COVID shot, the updated one, a little bit ago, and I went in, and now we had our cards to fill out, and the guy was like, we don't use those cards anymore. Nobody really even cares. I was like, it was, you know, I mean, in comparison to, I mean, I can see why people go conspiracy nuts about this, because to go from like having to show your ID and I can't go on a plane or do this to being like, who cares? Do whatever you want, you know? I mean, it's like, well, huh, what happened? Yeah.